I must say that the first thing I have to say is that the view you have from this commentary box is absolutely amazing, because you have this angle down on the pitch, which we ordinary people never normally see. And it makes a very, very big difference to watching the ball.
You think?
I think so, yes.
Easier?
The other thing that, of course, I've never seen before, looking directly at the pavilion, you have a very, very exaggerated view of the slope at Lord's, which is very, very clear.
Yes.
So, I mean, I'm amazed. And I love this automatically opening window you've got as well. That's great fun, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because Lord's actually has quite a reputation for being a bit stuck in the past, doesn't it? A bit fuddy-duddy. But in fact, it's not at all. And including our opening window, which is the only one in this glass bowl in which we sit, it makes a huge difference.
Well, we're sitting in this oasis in pretty well in the centre of London, and I always think every time I come to Lord's that it's always a treat, because you just don't somehow expect to see this anymore. I mean, there was a time when we used to sit on the edge of the pitch. Of course, we can't do that now, but nonetheless, it's still a great treat to be here. Very special.
But you must be a ridiculously busy man. Do you ever get the time to come down here and watch much cricket?
I mean, sadly I don't. I mean, I always put the test matches in my diary, but actually, in fact, I don't often get here. Occasionally I've got down to the Oval, usually in the afternoon. But to spend the whole day at Lord's is a special treat.
Yeah.
So I walked down to Lord's this morning, and so it's a good bit of exercise to get here. So
yeah. Where do you sit in the pavilion? Have you got a favourite area? Because it's quite a tradition down there. You stake out your territory, don't you?
You do a bit, but I mean, one of those balconies are a pretty good bet, because they're by the bar, so you can always nip in. and actually,
I suppose you're allowed one if you're off duty.
Well, in fact, actually, you can always squeeze in on that balcony. I mean, it seems ridiculous because they're not very big looking at them,
no.
Are they? I mean, I suppose when I'm really old and decrepit, I can then get a named seat, I suppose.
Yes, you do. I think you've got to be a certain age, haven't you?
I think
75.
75.
Yes, and I think you do. And then it's a much more relaxed process because you know where your seat is. How long have you been a member for?
I think it's not quite 15 years.
Right,
so,
it's quite reasonable length of time. And did you serve? You served your time.
It's ridiculous, isn't it? The process of becoming a full member. I mean, I think now the waiting list here is about 27 years.
Oh, I think so. And the best way to come on, I think it's you don't need to anymore. But for anyone listening, the best way to become an MCC member is to play. If you play for MCC, then that gets you accelerated. Did you play then? Talk me through your cricketing pedigree.
Well, I played a bit at school, but very badly. I was usually sort of number 10.
Yes. That's where I was too most of the time.
I bowled a bit, usually off breaks.
Did they spin?
Very seldom. I mean, to see these sort of 2,000 rev things that Maddie gets, it's pretty amazing.
Yes.
I wish I could do that.
Would it have registered in your off spinners?
I don't know. I might have got it around to turn 60 revs a minute. Something like that.
But did you enjoy it though?
Yes, I did. I mean, I think I found it a bit frustrating. I mean, I learned to field quite well. I mean, I did do that. I fielded close, but I never scored a lot of runs. And then I played a bit at university, and I've played a bit of sort of, stuff that you play in the countryside on rather uneven wickets, and so, rather terrifying with a local bowler bowling really rather fast at you.
But that is great, though. Isn't it? That's actually what proper cricket's all about. Really, it's not about these beautiful manicured grounds with the covers and everything.
I think the last time I played reasonably seriously was actually in Hampshire, in Winchester, when I was working down there, and that was great because we had a sort of half good cricket team. We still play cricket at Imperial College where I work, but I don't play anymore now.
No. Did you come down and watch though when you were younger? Did you remember? Did you sort the county? Well, you're from here.
Surrey, it was originally, but I don't know why. I mean, I think whether it was those. I mean, my great memory of cricket as a schoolboy were people like Locke and Laker, for example. And I remember
watching them.
Yes, I did once. Talk
me through watching Jim Laker bowl.
Well, I remember more
in black and
I remember
white.
more actually. Locke fielding at leg slip.
Right. Yes.
Because he seemed to be part of the partnership. Really.
Yes.
He anticipated where Laker was going to be putting the ball or where it was going to come off, and it was astonishing that of course that amazing record that Laker got.
Poor old Locke only got one.
But yes, that's right.
Were you a bit more of a Locke man than a Laker man, perhaps?
I don't think you could avoid being a Laker man, really.
No.
I mean, he was. I mean, what was it? 19 wickets in a Test match. But you did feel sorry for Locke then, because Locke actually had bowled quite well. I
Do you
suppose
remember that happening that day? If you were if they were on your radar anyway, as a youngster.
Yes, we were. just overjoyed. I remember it very well.
1956.
Yes, I remember it very well indeed. It was, at school at that time. What did we talk about? Well, we used to talk about in the Ashes. We talked about whether it was more boring to watch Bailey bowling to Mackay or Mackay bowling to Bailey.
They're actually quite a good competition there.
So Laker and Locke, were really exciting by comparison, really.
Yeah. So did you try and beat Jim Laker? Was that your non-spinning off spin?
No, never. No, actually, in fact, my best spin bowling has been in my back garden, bowling down a slope to my 9-year-old son. I have to say that, I wanted to make the ball break.
Yes.
And using a hard cricket ball, I then felt rather bad. I never hit him, but I always felt a bit nervous about bowling in the garden, really.
Yeah.
So, no, I can't claim any kind of glory at all.
No. They were golden years for Surrey, though, weren't they? They had a brilliant team. And I suppose as a youngster as you were, it was inevitable that you...
They were the best team, weren't they?
Yes.
They were the best team for a while.
Peter May and people like that.
May, of course, was amazing. And even after he'd retired and was brought back, and he was incredibly brave, wasn't he?
Yes.
It's astonishing watching him facing fast bowling and being hit all over the place and just standing there.
Yes. And Brian Close, too, taking it on in those days.
Close was a really rough, tough individual. Yeah. Well, there we are. It's a bit different now, isn't it? It's interesting. It's very interesting watching this game because when I watched the first 3 overs this morning, I couldn't believe what we were doing. And it was very odd because Moeen Ali, I felt very sorry for him really in a way because I don't think he should have probably been opening a bowling. It was, a few soft balls to get the batsman's eye in is probably not the ideal way of when you've got about 100 runs ahead and so on. But I think the atmosphere's changed. I think it's become a bit more humid. It's certainly warmer.
Now we're giving the old scientist territory here. Do you have any theories on humidity and swing bowling?
I met somebody here some years ago who was a Cambridge mathematician who then we got talking about swing. And he then sent me his essay on swing bowling and with all his mathematical calculations, which I couldn't really understand. But he was convinced there really was an issue that actually, in fact, given atmosphere, the way the bowler actually produced the ball from his hand could make a very big difference.
That's interesting because as a bowler, you feel that the atmospherics make a difference. And yet whenever we say that on here, it's getting humid now, so the ball will swing, you tend to get an R8 letter from a professor somewhere who says it's complete nonsense.
Well, this guy certainly believed that unevenness on one side of the ball made a very big difference.
Right, and so aerodynamic.
Yes, and he certainly brought that into his calculation. Sadly, I can't find his letter now that he wrote to me, but it was,
Did you understand it?
No, I didn't. The maths, it's ridiculous because I come from this highly sort of literate, mathematically literate institution, the Imperial College, where the mathematicians are unbelievably clever. But I never understand what they're talking about.
Do you pretend that you do?
Of course.
So, how do you like Brendan McCullum batting here, for instance, which is so unlike Test cricket these days? Do you like that, or is there a bit of a streak of purist in you, Robert?
No, I think it's great to watch that, and I think that's one of the things that's happened to the old style Test match where you sort of sat and waited and you attacked the balls that were weak, but you didn't go for it otherwise.
Yes, you met Jeff Boycott, have you?
Yes, of course.
He's very keen to meet you.
Well, one of the things that's very clear about cricket is that it's a very, very psychological game. All sports are psychological. But I just can't imagine how batsmen face the sort of bowling, even this morning, when it's going close to 90 miles an hour. The ability to react to that, I find remarkable because, you've got this pitch which is only, 22 yards long, and the reaction time is only about 0.2 of a second, and you're going at 80 miles an hour, so actually the human reaction time isn't fast enough to cope with that. Yeah. So how does a batsman anticipate where the ball's going to be? And that's a very interesting question. And I think that we don't really understand how that happens. So somebody with the so-called fast arm is very difficult to deal with.
Yes. Have you studied in any way sort of athletes or sort of reaction time? Have you any way encountered that sort of thing?
But more and more of that sort of work's going on universities. It's going on at places like Loughborough University. It's going on at Sheffield Hallam University, where they've got big sports science centres where they're looking at that sort of thing like reaction time and I think actually it's very clear that sports psychology has got a lot to do yet. And of course, one of the aspects of psychology, of course, is having teams which are comfortable with each other, because that makes a very big difference. And
yes.
I mean, who knows what went on?
No, but it's important. It's interesting how you recognise the importance of that team psychology.
It's important in everything, I mean, in science, it's very interesting. You consider it, each of us have got, 100 billion neurons in our brain. So our brains are
all of us?
All of us, roughly speaking. Yeah, and you take
some of us don't use them as well as others.
Well, you take Albert Einstein, the great model of the greatest brain of the 20th century. He gave his brain to science, and he left it to the university where he was working in New Jersey, Princeton, and his brain was put in formalin and pickled. It was actually a pickle jar, and it was left on a shelf, and people forgot about it. And 11 years later, some neuroscientists decided that's Einstein's brain, let's cut it apart. And they chopped it up into tiny little bits and counted the neurons. And they could see nothing which distinguished that brain from anybody else's brain. And the interesting thing is, if you think about it, so you and I sitting here together have got more brain power than Einstein. Because, of course, we've got, because we have together, we have
the combination of
that combination. So actually how people work together is really very, very important. And that applies certainly to the psychology of running a unit, and I think to a team too. And I think sometimes we forget that we don't, individual ability may not actually always be the great thing to have, but working, with the abilities of others, I suppose you could argue, I don't want to criticise Geoffrey Boycott's batting.
No, well, you can. He's not around. You're safe to do it at the moment, Robert.
Well, I'm not going to do that. But I think there's a great deal. Maybe that's one of the thinking that's gone on, that we need a team that really feels coherent together, communicating, and being comfortable with itself.
Are you fascinated by what makes us different? Is that something that just interests?
Yes, and it's always said to be genetics, and of course as a geneticist I don't believe that. I think it's environment. I think the environment shapes us much more than our genetics. And I think that's a really important thing that we tend to forget. And I think that's a great message, because actually I think, we can all have surprising ability with constant practice. You can be, a modestly good batsman if you practice long enough. You don't have, of course, innate ability obviously helps, and the extra little edge that you'll have as a really fine sportsman is really important. But a lot of people have a lot of talent that they don't develop. And I think that's one of the messages that we have to remember.
Yes, and why don't they develop it? Because they're lazy, they don't get the opportunity, they're unlucky.
They don't get inspired, they don't get mentoring, they don't see the opportunity. I think the lack of aspiration sometimes in schools, a whole range of reasons why that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I think, it's very clear that with sport, when a country is doing well at sports, suddenly new sportsmen, start appearing from schools who've been inspired by what they're watching.
Yes. What's it like for you? Because it seems that whenever you say, or pass judgment or pass an opinion on anything, it's immediately sort of quoted. And talking about sort of difficult issues like fertility, like genetics, and so on. are you forever living on a bit of a tightrope, and you're forever offending one section of the community, or do you manage to steer your way through that minefield?
I do think it's quite important to say what you really believe and think, actually, and I think certainly I've tried to do that with unpopular things. I don't really like political correctness. I'm prepared to write something which I know will be controversial. And I think you have to stand up eventually and take the criticism, and sometimes you get it wrong, and I think you have to listen, and you may need to adapt. And I've been wrong so often that, I realise that understanding that you're wrong eventually is probably quite a good thing.
What have you got wrong?
Oh, everything.
That can't be true, but it can't be right.
Well, one of the biggest things in my professional life was the development of in vitro fertilization. And, when it was first mooted, back in the early 70s, I went to lectures where people were showing their embryos, people like Robert Edwards, thinking, this is never going to work. And then realizing belatedly, actually, that as I was heavily involved in human reproduction, I had to be involved in the field because suddenly I'd actually really been rather ready to attitudinize about it and not realize that actually there was something that might really work there quite well.
Why don't you think it's going to work then?
Well, it seemed...
It might have to transform more lives, I suspect,
yes,
than possibly anything else.
No, I agree.
In our generation.
I think, between us around the world now, we're responsible for, 5.5 million babies that wouldn't have existed, something like that.
Really?
It's very easy to take huge pleasure in that, but we shouldn't ever forget that one of the things that we've all done in that field, and we don't admit this often enough, is that we've also peddled in failure because, only 1/3 of the time is that treatment successful. And it's very, very demanding for the couples that go through it. It's unbelievably anxiety-making. Some people find it really very, very, corrosive. They can't imagine doing it a second time. And I think the worst moment for anybody going through that treatment is when they finally see, after all the hurdles they've gone over, it's a bit like a horse race over the jumps, that they've got to the stage when they've actually got an egg that's fertilized and it's an embryo, and then that embryo is put back into the uterus. And for 12 days, people fantasize that they're pregnant finally after years of trying. And the moment when, of course, they realize that they're not pregnant, which of course happens most of the time, is unbelievably demanding. And one of two things happens. Either it builds a partnership together, or in fact, husband and wife or partners find it very, very difficult to deal with. And so I think we have tended to raise hopes a great deal without understanding sometimes their psychology or the sensitivity that's needed really to deal with that. And I think certainly helping people to come to terms with failure is an important part of that treatment, but we always talk it up. All the time it's seen as being, the great boon to women and men who can't have children. And I think, of course, that resolution can be very important because then you can walk away if it's handled properly. So I think that's one thing I have learned, and it wasn't an easy thing to learn. And I think it's very easy to congratulate yourself for being right at the forefront of a technology, and forget that actually that technology doesn't work a lot of the time.
Yeah. I suppose conversely, you talk about the shattering blow when it doesn't work, but the incredible joy when it does work must be something that you must have struck you countless times, isn't it? The incredible moment where actually it does all happen and the baby's produced.
Oh, yes. Of course I remember that. Again and again you see people who, against the odds, and you have some very strange stories. Sometimes, unbelievable stories happen because you can never really say that somebody can't get pregnant. Equally, you can never say somebody's going to be really easy to treat. And I think my best story is the times of tubal surgery before IVF started. And I was developing work to try and open tubes that were very badly damaged. And this woman came from the Middle East, who came with the most appalling history. She only had one fallopian tube. It was obvious she would never get treated. She'd never get pregnant. And the whole history showed very clearly that there was not the slightest chance of treatment. And I saw her in my outpatients and refused her treatment. She came back the following week and I refused her again. The third week she came back. She said, look, you have to understand, my husband will divorce me unless I have an operation. I said, but you can't have a pointless operation. And eventually, having discussed it with my team and friends and other colleagues, they said, well, maybe you should just have a look with a telescope, prove that really it's not worth doing. Look with the telescope under anesthesia, and it was obviously hopeless. So I told her this. I'd taken photographs, and she said, no, I'm not accepting this. I want you to open my tummy and have a look and repair the tube that was left. So the following week, after real soul-searching, and I didn't sleep that night, I opened her abdomen and fiddled around and closed her up again and told her that really it was hopeless. And she went back to the Middle East. And that was the end of it. And then about 13 months later, I was sitting in my outpatients, and the nurse came in and said, look, there's a woman outside who wants to see you. She hasn't got an appointment. She's flown a long way today. Do you mind seeing her as an extra? And I came in, and this woman came in a very long flowing garment right down to her ankles. And she said, as you predicted, I'm now pregnant, and I think I may be in labour. And this was the same woman who had got on the aircraft in this flowing gown, knowing that she was about to deliver. She was absolutely going to refuse to be delivered anywhere except at Hammersmith Hospital.
Excellent.
So she got on the plane in labour and flew for 4 hours. And she came in, and it was her. And she'd got pregnant.
How do you explain that? I mean, you must have more than fiddled about, was your expression. I mean, you must have done a bit more than that.
I don't know. I mean, really, I don't know. I mean, I think basically, sometimes biology surprises everybody. I mean, that, when we talk about science being the truth, as so many of my colleagues do, it's a nonsense, really. It's a version of the truth. And I think we have to understand that, we are not, we can never really be fully certain about anything. And actually, one of the great things about doing science now, of course, is that it becomes more problematic. I mean, modern physics is now much more difficult, I think, to fully understand because, quantum mechanics seems completely impossible. How can you have two states at once, for example? And I think we're beginning to...
I'm taking your word for this, by the way.
Well, I mean, you think about it, how, we now can look 13.5 billion light years away, but, beyond that, we still have this mystery of what's going on out there. And we'll never know. And I find that very humbling. I think it's very important. We should feel a bit threatened by that lack of ability to understand.
Yeah. Do you ever worry about, because you're moving in such extraordinary sort of high-powered medical areas and forming opinion, so on, do you ever worry about where it's all going to end? where is this sort of genetic improvement, if that's the right way? I mean, are we going to see genetically enhanced human beings in the near future?
I think we might, and it's one of the, I mean, I've got a book there to write, because, basically, the research we're doing now in my lab at Imperial was to try and find new ways of getting genes into embryos more efficiently so that we could then make, ultimately what we wanted to do, Carol Reed and I, my colleague, what we were hoping to do is to make pigs whose organs would not be recognized by the human immune system because they'd be genetically modified, so that then we could have organs for transplantation, hearts, livers, lungs, livers particularly, of course, quite useful because liver disease and heart disease are important. And we've got to that stage now where we can have a very, very efficient method of getting genes in. We haven't quite got the right genes in, but nonetheless it'll happen. Somebody else will do that in due course. And the trouble, of course, is if you can modify a pig so efficiently, there's another large animal that you might want to modify.
Indeed.
And given that we have the knowledge of how genes in some way control things like cognitive ability, memory, sporting ability, for example. I mean, ultimately, your strength, your speed, your stamina are certainly to some extent genetically determined. You could see how, in a highly commercial market, in an unregulated global society...
Well, that's more the point too, isn't it?
How somebody might start to want to meddle with the human genome.
Bad people might want to do with it.
Absolutely. And of course, if we believe that human life is sacred, which I think is one of the tenets of our ethical principles, that's one of the reasons why the assisted dying bill is so important. If human life is sacred, and if you make superhumans, what value is human life?
Silly question, possibly. But if you can have organs in pigs that the human body won't reject, why can't you put human organs into pigs that the pigs won't reject, and then you've got human organs going back in again?
When you translate the pig as well. Well, I think, we haven't got there yet.
No.
But, I think that would be unnecessarily complicated. But I think if you at the moment, people who are waiting for a transplant are basically waiting for a motor bicycle accident. That's what's happening in practice. So the number of people who need a transplant greatly exceeds the number of people who get one. Around the world, every 15 minutes, somebody's put on a transplant list, and there are many more people who never get on one. So the need for organs is massive. Now, of course, the real issue for many people will be, well, how can you justify using animals? Well, as long as we eat animals, it seems to me to be ethically much better to save life with animals. And of course, if you're going to make a pig transplant, you will have to treat that animal extremely humanely. The killing of that animal to get the organs would have to be under absolutely scrupulous conditions of anesthesia, for example, completely unlike an abattoir where animals are not that well treated when they're slaughtered. So I don't have a problem with that particularly, providing the animals are well treated. But the issue, I think, really is whether or not we can really control the acute rejection phenomenon, which of course is something we've not been able to do. But this technology looks like being a possibility that we might do in due course, maybe in 10 years' time.
And are you 100% excited about modification or genetic improvement or whatever you want to call it? Or, how much of that 100% is actually caution or even being more than caution. We're really worried about where it might go.
Genetic modification of animals has been going on very successfully now for more than 35 years, since John Gordon published his work in New York. And that's been one of the greatest breakthroughs in genetics, because it's enabled us to understand how genes work. It's enabled us to understand what happens when genes are missing or damaged. It's had a phenomenally important impact on cancer biology, much more important than the human genome sequencing, for example. But we always think of the genome as being the big flagship. But actually what preceded before, the ability to modify genes in mice, was actually a very, very great breakthrough. And it's really transformed biology. I mean, everybody who's in experimental biology would argue that, the mouse model and the mouse experiment. So transferring that to a large animal is just a small step, really. I mean, we haven't done anything very major. What we've just done is to try and look at ways you could improve it so you could make it possible in a larger animal, really.
But if you can make humans, run faster eventually, or make them taller, or make them stronger, or something, I mean, is that a possibility?
Well, if you look at the what's the premier event at the Olympics? It's the 1,500 meters, isn't it? Probably.
Yeah, I quite like the 100 meters myself, but yeah.
1,500 meters. I think over in 1900, the world record was about 4.4 minutes, 0.3 seconds, something like that. I think, and we've now got it down to we've shaved about 13%, I think, off it, something like that. But with genetic modification, you could double the speed of a human, couldn't you?
Could you? You tell me.
Well, you can do it in the mice. In mice, you can double their speed.
Really?
Yes. I mean, there's a man called Halimi who's done it.
That's been done?
Yes, he's done it in mice. And they have massive stamina. I'm just trying to think, what was Steve Ovett's record?
Oh, you're testing me now.
I think he did the 1,000 meters in about 3.5, something like that, 3:30, 3:33.
I'm not going to argue with you.
I can't remember. I don't remember, but it's something like that. And now it's, since then, of course, it's tailed off because we can't go much faster because there is a limit.
Isn't there?
Well, I think there is more.
Physical limit.
Well, because, muscular activity can only be, so good.
Gosh, the more you sort of just open the door ajar into your world of it, I mean, it's sort of...
Well, I mean, people say, are we evolving? And of course, what Steve Jones, I think, has argued, and I mean, he knows much more about genetics than anybody really, argues that really we modify our environment so much we don't need to evolve. But I suppose the other great interest in thing is what happens with artificial intelligence, and I don't know enough about that to talk about it intelligently, but I suppose eventually we may be challenged by machines that are more intelligent than we are, in which case this whole issue of biological improvement becomes almost kind of secondary importance.
Yeah. How do you explain all this in simple terms? I mean, you've just part of your life has been presenting television programs, scientific programs on complicated issues too. How do you present that without in any way sort of giving the feeling that you're talking down to people? Or
I think it's not difficult. I don't think you need to patronise people. I think really it's.
See, I felt a bit patronised by that scientist who told me that I shouldn't have an opinion on euthanasia.
Ridiculous. Yes, ridiculous. But I mean, I hope that everything I've said is intelligible.
Definitely.
This morning. So I mean, basically, I think certainly with the television, what I've always tried to do is not to be on screen for long pieces, but really short pieces, usually to have one point, one sentence, where there was clarity about what I was trying to say, which was, I mean, I had an amazing director in my first series, which was Your Life in Their Hands back in the 70s, John Mansfield. And John Mansfield used to stand me in front of the camera and said, "Robert, didn't understand a word of what you were saying," or "Robert, you're being really pompous." And it was a fantastic training. He was amazing, actually, and it made me really sort of think back and dissect about it. And actually, it's very, very important, I think, to just think about being intelligible. It should apply to all science. And even now, I think with a complicated PhD project, you should be saying to a PhD student, "Look, if you can't explain your project in 3 simple sentences to a layperson, it may not be worth doing."
And is science becoming so increasingly complicated that actually it's harder for the layperson to grasp?
Yes, and for the scientists to grasp too. I mean, it really is. I mean, reading Nature or Science are 2 great journals. For somebody like myself who's reasonably literate in science, but I think becomes I know that there will be 2/3 of the journal I will not understand, and that would be, most scientists would say that, I think. Yeah. It's become, we're knowing more and more about less and less in greater depth. And it's a real problem. And that's a real issue for school children, because from the age of 14 they're now being forced to specialise in a narrower way. And I'm worried about that in our society, because that is continued at university. And I think it's very, very important that we think wide. We think about the implications. We think about the issues which affect our society in a broad way, as well as being expert in the field.
Yeah. When you're speaking in the Lords as well, where again, it's quite a sort of random mixture of people, aren't there? Is that quite a stressful thing to do, to stand up there? And
it was when I started.
I mean, it's a different environment to the House of Commons.
Oh, I remember my second speech. I mean, my second speech, I waxed lyrical about some piece of chemistry which I didn't really understand, which I said was being taught rather badly at universities, and sat down feeling very pleased with myself that I'd finished, all round. I said, Robert, what a great speech. And I walked out thinking I'm going to go to the nearest...
Did you script it, by the way? Did you read a speech?
No, I never read my speeches. And I walked towards the bar, thinking I need a double whiskey. And as I was walking down this long, dark corridor, I heard the one word behind me you never want to hear in the House of Lords. It's a very elderly voice saying, Lord Winston, that was a very interesting speech. I turned around, it was a Nobel Prize winner for that piece of chemistry,
oh, really?
George Porter. And I had to give him a lot of whiskey in the bar. We became very firm friends afterwards.
Does interesting mean anything but, then?
Absolutely, of course,
yes.
yeah. Typically English understatement.
Yeah. It must be pressurised, eh? People settling back there and, because they are, it's obviously your big moment, isn't it? Do people get a bit stressed?
Yes, and some people get very pompous too, because basically there's a convention in the House of Lords which is quite interesting, which nobody perhaps knows about. Basically, when you give your maiden speech, there's always the speaker following is notified that you're following a maiden speaker, so you're told that. So you prepare beforehand, and you look at his CV a little bit, and the convention is you always say, this was the most amazing speech, you've never heard a speech of such eloquence, and we look forward, we can't wait to hear the next time this man will contribute, because, this is going to change our view about so many aspects, and his expertise is as unparalleled. And of course, some people really believe that. so when they get up to speak again, they start to get a bit pompous.
Well, you haven't been pompous at all. Well, thank you for coming to see us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, look, they're sweeping up out there, so let's hope that...
I think we might see some play.